All right, it is noon, so we are going to get started. Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for coming to this presentation on the changes coming to the U.S. Food and Drug Administration's rules regarding the use of medically important antibiotics in all animals. My name is Dr. Caitlin Macy, and I am the District 9 Field Veterinarian with the Board of Animal Health. And I'm also leading the state's Veterinary Medical Reserve Corps, which is involved in training, developing, and deploying animal emergency response teams. Today's speaker with us is Dr. Debbie Boyd. Dr. Boyd earned her doctorate of veterinary medicine from the University of Illinois. She then worked in a largely dairy ambulatory private practice in New Hampshire for 13 years. She joined the Indiana State Board of Animal Health in 2019 as the field veterinarian in District 4 and serves as the director of animal drugs and residue prevention. She met her husband on a dairy farm in Massachusetts, and together they have a 9-year-old daughter. They all enjoy bike riding for fun. Just a couple of housekeeping items before we begin. We will have a Q&A session at the end of Dr. Boyd's talk. Everyone's muted currently, and if you think of any questions during the presentation, please type them into the chat box, and we'll try to address as many as we can. You can either direct them to BOAH or everyone in the chat section of your screen. So with that, please take it away, Dr. Boyd.
All right, thanks for having me. So this talk is meant to be an update on some recent changes to drug rules and availability, and kind of an overview and review of some proper drug use. And so a lot of this might already be familiar to you, or if you're like me, it just led to more questions. But we'll try to answer some questions that you might have. And so we're going to find out what's happening with animal drugs. So first, just a little bit of history on some recent changes to drug rules. FDA created a plan to improve judicious use of antimicrobials in veterinary medicine and to prevent antimicrobial resistance. So this plan was laid out in their guidance for Industry 209 back in 2012. In that guidance, you'd find a review of some scientific literature on the issue of antimicrobial resistance and a recommendation of 2 principles that they wanted to meet going forward. So those principles were to phase out the use of medically important antimicrobials for growth, promotion, and feed efficiency in food-producing animals, and to bring the therapeutic uses of medically important antimicrobials under the oversight of veterinarians, and with the goal there to ensure the safe food and sustainable long-term use of antimicrobials. So the next step is here. But following GFI 209, there were some steps that directly or indirectly help accomplish those 2 principles. So you'll probably remember back in 2015, the VFD final rule was put into place, and that clarified the veterinary feed directive regulations and supposedly created a framework for authorizing the use of medically important antibiotics in feed to improve the efficiency of the VFD program. And then GFI 213 started to put GFI 209 into effect by switching all feed and water MIAs from to prescription or VFDs if they weren't already. And then it did remove the production uses from labels of all drugs that were affected or had that label, which there were a total of 31 then that did switch or remove those uses from their labels. And this was finalized by January 1st of 2017. So all of those changes had been made by then. So now this next step, which is what we're going to focus on here for a few minutes, which is the guidance for Industry 263, which is going to switch the remaining antibiotics from over-the-counter to prescription. So this is the full-on title of GFI 263. but it's kind of exactly what it says. It's a guidance for industry, and it's basically a document instructing drug sponsors how to go about changing their product label from over-the-counter to prescription. There's a list of steps that they need to complete, and also a little bit of background on why this is happening. So if you're interested in reading it, it is online. So there's sort of two categories of drugs that are discussed in the guidance. So the pioneer drugs, or the new animal drug applications. So they will go about submitting an application, so this is voluntary, of course, to submit the application or remove their product from the market. The final rule was put into place in June of 2021. So, and then with a 2-year sort of period to complete all of the steps. But the FDA asked these pioneer drugs to decide if they wanted, to go ahead and make the marketing change status, or pull their drug from the market. And then, whatever they decided, they still had until, June 11th of 2023 to complete all the steps. But the application that they need to complete is, basically a request, and then they had to submit a copy of their new label. And then for the generics, or the abbreviated new animal drug applications, the FDA would contact those generics once they knew the pioneer drugs were going to have a label change, so that the generics could align their label with their reference listed new animal drug. But then they do have to, take the same steps as the pioneer drugs to change the label. So we're talking about over-the-counter drugs, and this is FDA's definition of over-the-counter, just for your information. There's a lot of boxes to check for a drug to be, allowed to be marketed as over-the-counter. So, FDA, I guess, has changed their decision on what drugs will fall under this definition. So we know that FDA regulates all human and animal antibiotics and most drugs, along with the EPA that does some drugs. But so right now there's, the 3 marketing statuses of over-the-counter, prescription, or veterinary feed directive. And what GFI 263 is going to do is move all the remaining medically important antimicrobials to prescription. And this covers all routes of administration, and will affect food producing and companion animal medications. So this is the label that you'll see, or we do see on all prescription drugs, and will soon be on the packaging of the current over-the-counter medically important antimicrobials. So once this label is on the packaging, they can no longer be sold without a prescription. So, the drugs themselves are not changing, just the label and the marketing status. So, what drugs are actually involved? So medically important antimicrobials are the ones that are the same or in the same class of drugs that are used to treat humans. So, this is, again, to help with antibiotic resistance, this additional oversight on some of these drugs that are important to humans as well. So a lot of the, antibiotics that we think about are medically important. There are some exceptions, and this is, a few exceptions that I found. And these are generally in veterinary medicine used for feed medications in large animals. So here's a list of the actual drugs that are going to be affected. Again, all routes of administration. I look at this list and they seem like they're, more of the older antibiotics that sort of were grandfathered in with an over-the-counter marketing status. So they're going to be updated. And producers often, wonder, or maybe don't always think about how antibiotics are, different from some of the other drugs they use. So this is some drugs that will not be affected because they're not antibiotics. So these will not change as far as availability to producers. So currently, 96% of medically important antibiotics already have a VFD or prescription status. And this is based on volume or weight of drugs that are sold. That's how they measure this. So we already know that all medically important antimicrobials for use in feed or water of food-producing animals are VFD or prescription, and some parental route antibiotics are already prescription as well. So there's 4% of, again, MIAs that are based on volume that are currently over the counter. So this is what's going to change, just the remaining 4%. So one take-home message is that MIAs will no longer be available for purchase over the counter. So they won't be available at feed stores, pet stores, or online without a prescription from a veterinarian. So, they'll need a prescription or they'll need to get the drug directly from their veterinarian. So as part of our outreach efforts about this GFI 263 for producers and lay people, we came up with some frequently asked questions. We do have a handout on our website that kind of puts these all together with the questions and answers. And those are, available if you, have producers or you want to have those to distribute. They are available. But, our outreach has really been to help producers get ready for this change so they're not surprised when, they can't go to the feed store and pick up a bottle of penicillin. We also don't want veterinarians to be overwhelmed by requests for prescriptions or requests for, new clients. So we're just trying to reach out and get this message out to as many people as possible. So some of our questions. So no, a vet will not be required to examine each animal. That's not the case now. As you know, veterinarians use protocols, good relationships and regular visits under a VCPR to, prescribe drugs without seeing every animal. So there may be more visits necessary if new clients are reaching out, and small farms where there's fewer interactions with the veterinarian, they may need visits more often per sick animal, but every animal will not need to be examined. And it's really up to the veterinarian to decide how they feel, comfortable prescribing drugs, as long as they're following the VCPR requirements. So this is kind of a hot topic too. What is the VCPR? So again, the FDA has 3 sort of requirements to make a VCPR valid. So the veterinarian is assuming responsibility for making judgments about the patient, and the owner has to agree to comply with the veterinarian instructions. So we're really expecting a two-way street with this relationship. The vet has to have sufficient knowledge of the patient or of the premises by visits where the animal or animals are housed. And the veterinarian agrees to provide any necessary follow-up for evaluation or care for a case of an adverse reaction or treatment failure where the animal may need a follow-up visit. And this doesn't necessarily mean that the veterinarian themselves has to provide that. Emergency clinics can provide follow-up care, associates as well, or on-call sharing between clinics, as long as there is a vet to provide sort of emergency care if needed. So sufficient knowledge is kind of vague, but again, this is from an FDA document, so it's saying a relationship can only exist when the veterinarian has recently seen and is personally acquainted with the keeping and care of the animal by examination of the animal or by appropriate and timely visits to the premises. So FDA does sort of single out drug manufacturers and distributors, by saying this is an example, perhaps, of a veterinarian that should not be dispensing prescription drugs to lay people, unless they're meeting the above criteria. So just one option where perhaps the VCPR is not necessarily valid. So what should a producer do if they don't have a VCPR with a veterinarian? They should find one now. So we don't, want people waiting till the last minute, and veterinarians are not obligated and shouldn't feel that way to make emergency calls for non-clients, because, your time matters too. So, and then, if a client, maybe isn't real regular, they should probably reach out to their current DVM and just discuss VCPRs so that they're prepared. And again, veterinarians have control over what makes a VCPR valid in their practice. There's no legal requirements for length of validity or minimum number of visits to a farm. So, that's something as a veterinarian you can decide for your clinic. Also, some clinics, have official signed, letters or forms that they sign with clients, and others just have sort of an understanding, if they're there so often. So nope, we don't want people sharing prescriptions because that's illegal. Unfortunately, I'm sure it happens. And people will find drugs if they aren't too worried about following the rules, but we want to discourage that. And no, we don't recommend stocking up. The medications will eventually expire. We've all dropped a bottle of drug on the ground and then it's gone immediately. We can lose power to our refrigerators. So it's just sort of preventing the inevitable, right? So we're encouraging people, not to do this and to work at finding a VCPR and a vet now if they don't have one. I did have a question from a producer who contacted our office asking if it's legal to use up medication that they have on hand after June 11th. And yes, of course, they can still use up the product that they have. Some of these over-the-counter drugs may still be available after June 11th because the distributors are allowed to use up the drugs that are already in the marketing channels. It's just after June 11th, anything that does enter the marketing channels will need to have a prescription label. So this rule, is for food producing and companion animal medications. I did find what seems to be sort of a loophole. So there does seem to be some fish antibiotics that aren't falling under the list of drugs that are affected by GFI 263. So those might still be out there. Some of the examples are Aquamox, which is amoxicillin, fish biotic, doxycycline, and lots of other similar products. So just a heads up that those might still be available. So unfortunately, they probably won't be able to find the prescription antibiotics at farm supply stores or other locations where they may have gotten drugs in the past. Pharmacies are regulated by state rules, may require permits, and so your local Rural King is probably not set up to handle that situation or produce prescription labels in the store. So most likely these will have to be purchased from a veterinarian through an online pharmacy or sort of drop ship situation through a veterinarian. So sort of a recap, GFI 263. So all remaining medically important antimicrobials will transition to prescription by June 11th of 2023. And that's going to be all routes of administration. The prescription drugs probably won't be available in person. So they'll have to be purchased through a veterinarian or online with a prescription. And we don't, of course, recommend stocking up. We encourage animal owners to be prepared and establish a BCPR before this deadline. So now we're going to talk about some other sort of drug rules and review drugs. So since you might be writing more prescription labels, here is just a reminder of what is required on a drug label. And some of this information can be on the packaging already, so you don't have to repeat that if you're selling, a full bottle or a full package of the drug. But otherwise, this information should be included somewhere on the label. And then prescription records. So in your veterinary clinic, this is the information that the FDA would like to see in the records, because these records should be accessible to the FDA if they ever came to ask for them, say following a residue, and they should be kept for at least 2 years. And this is important for you as well, sort of to protect yourself. If there's ever an issue with a client, you can have the records to back up, what you did and what you recommended. So, where does BOAH really come in and play a role in animal drugs? So we talked about how, drugs are regulated by the FDA. So BOAH and states do not have really much involvement in the regulation of how, drugs are labeled and used and that. So we are here more to help people, producers, if they have questions, and again, sort of get the information out to them if there's changes that are relevant. And then as far as residue side of things, again, that's the tissue residues are really regulated at the federal level. The USA FSIS detects those in federal processing plants, and even if a residue is detected from an animal that's gone through a state inspected plant, samples from state plants are sent to the FSIS lab for confirmation and additional testing, and then FSIS does sort of take over from there. They send the information to the FDA because a tissue residue results in adulterated food, so the FDA then follows up with a producer or does any investigation. Occasionally, FDA will reach out to BOAH, for trace back of the animals if necessary, or occasional visits to producers, just sort of for assistance. Milk residues are sort of much more involved, or BOAH is much more involved with milk drug residues. Our dairy division responds to all the milk residues because they require immediate response since milk is shipped daily. And the state, again, does investigations of those, follows up with the clients and the producers. The dairy division also, sort of regulates or at least monitors drugs on dairy farms through the PMO rules and the inspections. So when we're talking about drugs, what are we really saying? So it's a pretty broad definition. This is again FDA's rule. So diagnosis, cure, mitigation, treatment, or prevention of disease, and it can affect the structure or function of the body. So all the drugs need to be FDA approved to be legal for use in animals. If they're not, then the FDA does investigate those, and they do have a list of warning letters that they send to companies that sell products that fall under this definition of a drug. So some of those are, natural products. There's a lot of CBD products right now. There's one that was a flea product, dewormer, a product for treating laminitis. So all of those things, if they fall under the definition of drug, but they haven't gone through FDA approvals, then they are considered to be illegal for use in animals. We probably all remember hearing about AMDUGA, which is the Animal Medicinal Drug Use Clarification Act. So that was back in 1994, and it made extra label drug use an FDA regulated activity. So prior to this, extra label drug use was illegal. So it was really beneficial, particularly to food animals, because there weren't, a lot of drugs that were labeled for food animals or for specific, treatments for food animals. So this is really greatly beneficial to veterinarians. So what did it do? What did it allow veterinarians to do? It allowed extra label drug use under, certain requirements. But extra label drug use is the deviation from the label for basically any reason. So it's not included, but not limited to use in a different species or production class, different route of administration, indication or disease, frequency, dose, or duration. So change to any of those things from the label causes it to be an extra label drug use. Some of these might seem kind of picky. For instance, some examples of extra label drug use that I've seen, giving injectable flunixin orally, using penicillin at a higher dose than the label. So basically every use of penicillin. On a dairy farm, testing fresh cow milk instead of following the labeled withdrawal time. Those would all be extra label drug uses. So lots of options for extra label drug use. So for extra label drug use to be legal, it needs to follow, these rules. So it can only be used on FDA approved human or animal drugs. There needs to be a valid VCPR. It can only be used for therapeutic purposes, not for production uses, and it's always prohibited in feed. So VFD drugs are not allowed to be used extra label. And if it ends up resulting in a residue, then it goes back and becomes illegal. And then there are some specific prohibitions for extra label drug use, which we'll talk about. So this is an algorithm for extra label drug use in food producing animals. And basically, you need to use the drug labeled for that species and indication if possible. And if there's not a drug available, you can use the drug for food animals if there's one that's labeled, a different class or species, but still food animals. And then if there's not a drug that you could use that's labeled for food animals, then you can look at a non-food animal drug or human drug, but only if there's enough information for a scientifically valid extended withdrawal period. So if you can't come up with a scientifically valid withdrawal period, that would not be legal, I guess. Convenience and cost are not sort of allowable uses of extra label drugs. So here's the list that we've all seen. It's been around for some time about the drugs that are prohibited for extra label drug use under any circumstances for food producing animals. And then more recently, cephalosporin extra label drug use was changed the rules. This was back in 2012, and it really only affects the major food animal species, so cattle, swine, chickens, and turkeys. Basically, what it allows is the extra label use for a different indication or disease, but it shouldn't be used in a different species or production class. It still needs to be used at this sort of approved dose and frequency. So it does limit a little bit what cephalosporin can be used extra label. It doesn't include cefepirin, which is a first generation cephalosporin. We would know it as today or tomorrow intermammary treatments. So that is excluded from this rule. Now, in companion animals, there's a little bit more leeway because the food supply should not be affected. You still have to maintain the required records and label the drug appropriately, but there are no no approved drugs that are prohibited from extra label drug use in companion animals, and economic reasons are valid extra label use in companion animals. So what is a producer's responsibility in extra label drug use? So they are required to keep records of their uses, again, 2 years minimum. They are required to identify treated animals. This doesn't have to be an official identification, but they should be able to find that animal on their, on their premises if they've used extra label drug use. They should not make extra label drug use decisions on their own. They need to work with a veterinarian. Even if the drug was over the counter, an extra label drug use would make that a prescription. And so should be working with a veterinarian. And they need to prevent drug residues in meat and milk. The veterinarian's responsibilities are similar, but they are really required to diagnose the condition for extra label drug use. They should keep records of the uses, again, for at least 2 years, including the condition that was treated, the animal ID, withdrawal time, and how the drug was used. Veterinarians are responsible for extending the withdrawal time and communicating that to the producer. And then they also, need to know the rules about what's allowed or not allowed with extra label drug use. So on to a little bit of a different topic. So withdrawal times are important for preventing drug residues. Drugs that are approved for use in food animals include withdrawal times for their labeled uses. But there are some special cases to consider in topics that might come up with clients. So VARAD is very useful for food animal veterinarians. This is the Food Animal Residue Avoidance Data Bank, and this is their website. It is a great resource for labeled withdrawal times, drug uses, and restrictions for food animals. There is an option for requests for specific extra label drug use withdrawal times. It says that can take up to 3 days to get a response, but I found it to be generally a little less than that. But it is something to prepare for in advance if possible. Preferably have the extended withdrawal time before using the drug, but it is also available after the fact. So FARAD is funded by the USDA. It's overseen and operated by faculty and staff at the veterinary schools at UC Davis, the University of Florida, Kansas State, North Carolina State, and Virginia, Maryland. They do some research, and they use previous research to extrapolate withdrawal times, and they do write articles, which are often in JAVMA or on their website. So FARAD's goal is to provide advice to veterinarians regarding extra label drug use and withdrawal times to prevent drug residues. So, we assume that if we follow the labeled withdrawal time on a drug, we should be safe from residues. But withdrawal times are established by drug companies using healthy animals. And so we know that sick cows, have altered metabolisms. They might have diseases that affect drug excretion. They'll have inflammation, and milk cows will have decreased milk production. So these can affect, how a drug is eliminated from an animal. So this is, a case where record keeping is important, so that if a residue occurs, but you follow the label use and the withdrawal times, it can just help if there's ever an issue. So there was a study that FARAD supported in 2015. It's in JAVMA if you want to look it up. But it looked at flunixin elimination in healthy and mastitis cows. So it looked at elimination or residues in the milk. So it was a pretty small study. There were just 10 mastitis cows and 10 control cows. But they were each treated with one labeled dose, IV, of flunixin, And then the withdrawal time for that use is 36 hours for milk. So at 36 hours, 8 of the 10 mastitis cows still had residue above the tolerance limit. None of the controlled cows had a level above the tolerance after 24 hours. And then at 60 hours, they still found a residue in 3 of the 10 cows above the tolerance limit. So it just kind of illustrates that, the residues can still occur, and drugs may not be eliminated as expected in animals that are ill. So, I don't think there's much we can do here except be aware of the situation and be prepared. So, how does weight affect residues? So I think we all know that estimating weight can be inaccurate, especially if we're using sort of like generalized set doses. So if we're looking at, small, medium, large cows, there can be quite a range. So this again was a study done by Zoetis, and they just looked at dairy cow weight ranges. So the first part of the study, they weighed over 700 dairy cows on a scale and grouped them by lactation number, and just looked at, for each lactation number, how the weight can vary. So lactation 1, which was the smallest, the cows ranged from 1,010 pounds to 1,695 pounds. For lactation 3, the cows range from 1,020 pounds to 2,265 pounds. And this is the graph showing those weights with a scale. So, I know I never dosed a cow for 2,000 pounds or more. So probably we've all underestimated or overestimated weights of animals. But the second part of their study, they looked at just over 400 cows, and they were measured with a weight tape. So in this study, lactation 1 animals ranged from 1,000 pounds to 1,675 pounds. And lactation 2 and greater ranged from 1,035 to 2,000 pounds. So again, quite a range. And the issue is that if we underdose animals, the drug may not be effective. We may not actually be clearing the infection or treating the disease effectively. So we want to avoid that. And then if we overdose, if we give too much for their weight, it could result in a residue depending on how much that drug is overdosed. And we don't want to do that either. So I know scales are not available on very many farms, but weight tapes do a fairly decent job, at least of getting a range closer than what we might if we just estimate. So I've seen some issues with dry cow treatments. They're a little bit trickier, I think, because their withdrawal times sometimes have 2 parts for the milk plus the meat, and and they're all different. So each dry treatment has a different withdrawal. So for example, tomorrow, which is cephalosporin, has a milk withdrawal of 72 hours after calving, with a minimum of 30-day dry period. And then the meat withdrawal is 42 days. Dry clox, which is cloxacillin, has a minimum 30-day dry period, and then no milk withhold after calving. And this one recently resulted in a farm having a milk drug residue. They had a cow with a dry period that was close to 30, but 26 days or so. And they looked at the label and they saw that there was no milk withhold. So they, it's not necessarily clear right on the label about the minimum dry period. So they didn't realize that that could result in a residue if they started milking her. And so, but it did. And so that's, again, something that maybe veterinarians want to discuss a little bit more closely with clients and make sure that, that those requirements are clear. The third option, which is just shows, the variability in withdrawal times, is quartermaster has a 6-week minimum dry period plus 96 hours after calving, and the meat is 60 days plus 96 hours after calving. So that's a fairly significant, and clients that have animals, cows abort, partway through their dry period, can really make things difficult for what to do with that animal. So again, just places where I've seen some issues. And then what about using a drug in an unapproved class of animals? So that would be, using it in a dairy cow when the label is for beef cattle, for instance. But that makes the tolerance for the food products down to 0. So a lot of times the food products do have a tolerance level, so it might not be 0. But, as long as it's below that, it's not considered a residue. So in this case, if any residue is detected, that would result in adulterated food. So it can significantly extend the withdrawal time. This graph was designed by Dr. Meredith Jones at Oklahoma State, and it's just kind of a generic elimination curve. But you can see where the blue line, that's where the drug is below the tolerance level for the labeled species. As far as the orange line, that's where potentially the drug would be at 0 detection. So, that can be significant. And this is where FARAD, can help with this type of information, getting an extended withdrawal time. But it is something just to be cautious of if using drugs in different species or production classes. So minor species are also a little bit of a different case, and there is some more leeway allowed by the FDA because these animals are less likely to enter the food chain, or if they do, it's in less volume than the major species. So the major species are horses, dogs, cats, cattle, pigs, turkeys, and chickens. And then, of course, for food animal species, we just have cattle, pigs, turkeys, and chickens. So the FDA did pass the MUMS Act in 2004. So that's the minor use, minor species. And it was a law that intended to make more medications legally available for these minor species and uncommon diseases. So it was really for drug companies to encourage them to get more labeled uses. And they could do that by using a conditional approval of their drugs, which that allows a drug to come on the market before all of the testing, the required testing, is completed. So they do sort of the minimum amount of testing to make it safe for the animals. And then they can start to market it so that they're, recouping some of their expenses while finishing up the testing. And again, I'm sure there's lots of details on how that works. And they can't do that indefinitely, but it gives them a little bit of a kind of a head start on full approval. They can also have a designation, which is they get 7 years of exclusive marketing rights before generics can come on the market. So again, just gives them a little bit more financial incentive to come up with some of these drugs and labels. And there's also grants for testing and additional studies. And then indexing is sort of the third option. And this would be for very rarely used drugs or for, very minor species. And basically there's almost no testing required. But you can't use indexed drugs in food animals. So it's more for uses in, exotics or zoo animals. But again, it's just some options out there for these minor species. And then FDA did put out a compliance policy guide for extra label use of VFD drugs. which we've already discussed is illegal. But it's kind of another option. The FDA has some enforcement discretion on whether to take action if these uses are put into action. So if you're going to use this option as far as extra label drugs for VFD, drugs in minor species, there is the guide on this that I would recommend reading, because there are some requirements and record keeping that's needed, so that the FDA doesn't take action. And it doesn't make this use of VFD drugs legal. It just, if it's done correctly according to the guide, the FDA most likely won't take any action on it. All right, so compounding. This is when drugs are combined, mixed, or altered to create a medication for an individual animal or a small group of animals. A drug that's compounded from an approved human or animal drug is not adulterated and is considered a legal extra label use. So under AMDUCA, that would include like crushing tablets into a paste, adding flavor, or combining two injectable medications into a syringe. But if the drug is compounded from an unapproved drug or bulk drug substance, it is considered adulterated and is certainly prohibited in food-producing animals. So the focus of FDA's enforcement on compounded animal drugs, they're really more concerned about cases where there might be human or animal safety concerns, if it's used in food-producing animals, or if they're basically exact copies of marketed FDA-approved drugs, because those have been through the testing requirements, rather than compounding from unapproved drugs. And if drugs are compounded without a patient-specific prescription, so compounding a larger amount of drug to use as office stock. So this is where the FDA generally is concerned about compounded animal drugs, but they do understand that sometimes this is necessary for animal health. And so they put out the guidance for Industry 256, which was finalized last year in April. And it, again, addresses some situations where the FDA will take enforcement discretion for certain violations of the compounding rule. So there's some rules, again, in this guidance where if followed, they don't necessarily intend to enforce the rule. So if the drugs are used to fill patient-specific prescriptions for non-food producing animals, if veterinarians want to compound office stock for non-food producing animals, and if some antidotes need to be compounded. So the FDA has a list of bulk drug substances that can be used for in these cases. So if a bulk drug substance is on this list of the FDA, it's likely not, they're likely not concerned about some office stock being compounded. But there are also lists of bulk drugs that have been reviewed and not listed. So basically, those are not allowed to be used for compounding office stock. And then there's a list of drugs under review, which they're still kind of looking into. And it basically can be used until it's moved to one of the other two lists. So this is, again, an algorithm for determining if a compounded drug is, going to be eligible for enforcement discretion. So for the individual patient, as long as you're not using, or as long as there's not already an FDA approved product, you're probably going to be okay compounding, as long as you have a medical rationale, which would need to be included on the prescription. And then for office stock, if it's on the list of bulk drug substances, again, it's probably going to be approved for enforcement discretion. But again, if this is something that you do or are interested in doing, I would recommend, reading through the document, the GFI, and those are actually not too bad. They're not usually too long or bulky to read, as some documents might be. That is all I have, so I will take any questions.
Yeah, thank you so much, Dr. Boyd, for this fantastic presentation. While she's taking a quick break for water, this is an ideal time to submit any comments or questions you have in the chat. Please direct them to BOAH or everyone in the chat section, and we will answer those. Additionally, if you want to raise your hand, we can unmute you. So we'll just take a couple of minutes if anyone has or a minute or so. If anyone has any questions, please put them in the chat or go ahead and raise your hand and we will address your questions. Oh, there's a, yeah, we have her muted. All right, Savannah, go ahead.
Hi there. Are you guys able to hear me?
Yes.
Okay, wonderful. I know that our office orders methimazole, compounded transdermal for cats, and we dispense for a multitude of them. With this new change in legislation, are we going to have an individual compounding prescription for each cat? We will no longer be able to bulk order compounded and dispense?
I don't think so. I think this is more to give more leeway to,
Okay.
yeah, so if you're doing that now, and as long as, you're following all the record keeping and labeling, you should be fine.
Okay, great. Thank you so much.
Thank you for the question. Do we have any other questions? Either go ahead and put it in the chat or raise your hand. All right, we have a question. We use Otapacks that are compounded from Roadrunner. We buy them in bulk and then prescribe them to individual animals. Is this still allowed?
I think as long as the drugs are on the list of bulk drug substances, then yes, I believe that should be fine. Again, the rule is not really to make things more strict. But again, if you have a question, probably the FDA is going to have better answers if it's not obvious in their GFI document. And there is a list online. Again, you can look up the list of bulk drug substances approved for compounding office stock, and it will list all the drugs. So that's just online under the FDA website.
And I can go ahead and put that, Kristen, in the chat box. All right. Do we have any other questions? All right, great. Well, thank you all for attending today. I think we will wrap this up. Thank you all for joining. You will be receiving continuing education credit for this webinar via email in the coming weeks. So I don't know if anyone called in specifically, but if you did call in, please email us to let us know that you joined, and we will send you your certificate. And again, if you have any questions, please feel free to email us. And we will get to your questions. So again, Kristen, I'll go ahead and put that in the chat. I just have to track down the document, and thank you all for attending. I hope you have a wonderful day.